a full theater for the presentation by Dr. Ed McDonald. I hope everyone enjoyed the speaker's tour and the walk up Great George. And as you'll notice, now that we've fired Chief Justice Jenkins as the weatherman, the sun is shining. It
was a work in progress.
Our guest speaker today, Ed McDonald, is an associate professor of history at the University of Prince Edward Island. He is the acting chair of the history department. He was born and raised on the island and completed his undergrad studies at PEI. He then went to Kingston, Sir John A. Macdonald's home, where he earned his master's and his PhD in Canadian history at Queen's University. And he came back to PEI in the mid-80s and became the curator of history in the Island Provincial Museum System. And he has edited the award-winning popular history journal called The Island Magazine. In 2000, after 2 years secondment as Director of Research with UPEI's Institute of Island Studies, Ed joined the History Department at the Provincial University, where he teaches PEI, Atlantic, Canadian, and Public History, and as I say, is acting chair of this department. Dr. McDonald is the author or co-author of 5 books and over 2 dozen articles exploring various aspects of the social and cultural history of PEI. His most recent book is If You're Strong-Hearted, Prince Edward Island in the 20th Century, The Landscapes of Confederation. And it's a co-authored collation of materials pertaining to the Charlottetown Conference of 1864, so he knows the subject well. That book will be published this fall. His the previous book of the same title at the start. And finally, when he's not teaching or lecturing on other subjects, he continues a major research project examining tourism and culture on Prince Edward Island. So I invite you to welcome Dr. Ed McDonald.
Thank you, Gordon. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me out at the dunes the other night, and thank you for having me here this morning. A 2-hour lecture is quite a stint, not for the lecturer. I'm the youngest of a family of 9. I never got to talk until I was 12. Not for me, but for you. And so I hope that you'll be free to ask questions, have comments as we go along. And I was up late into the night preparing slides for you so you'd have some pictures to look at. I'm glad Gordon sat in the front row. I was beginning to think this was like being in church. No one likes to sit in the front pew. But my joke actually was going to be that I had never appeared before, judged before. And now I can say to someone, yes, I've been before 60 judges in my time. The last 2 times I gave a lecture at conferences, I had a quarter of an hour. So 2 hours is either way too much time or too little. I can actually spend about a semester talking about some of the underlying themes here. But what I want to do is start by asking you some questions. And I don't know everybody's name, so that I can only put on the spot those people from Prince Edward Island that I know and maybe a handful of other judges. But this is an easy question. So what did you think of the film? We're going to do a public history thing. So what did you think of the film? How was it? Now, did it make you feel a proud Canadian?
Yes.
That's good, because that's their job. That is their job, right? I don't think you're supposed to come to an historic site run by the federal level of our government through parks and go away saying, well, wonder if I can get my green card for you are supposed to feel proud, aren't you? Proud to be a Canadian. So, that's good. I look at it and like some of the Islanders here, I say, that's Pam Stevenson. I went to university with her. Ben Kinder, he works at the Confed Center. My God, Urban Carmichael. The funniest man on Prince Edward Island is Darcy McGee. But can you tell me, can anyone, if you look at this, what impressions, what things did they emphasize? Because you can imagine, this was done by the feds, right? So there were 15 committees, stakeholder meetings for about 7 years, and then a process of editing that weeded out anything that would offend anybody, possibly, although that's never entirely possible. What do they emphasize in that film? This actually comes back to my lecture. It's not part of my prepared lecture, but...
Facial hair.
Yes. That is true. Facial hair is very important, and the camera is very careful to try to avoid the marks of the paste where they stuck the facial hair on. Although that does so. Yes?
I got a great sense of people interacting with people.
Social. It's all about people forging relationships with other people. Not the kind of relationships that are formed at bars after 2 a.m, but relationships upon an emotional bond on which a country is based. Excellent. I was told that the judges were very acute, although used to listening to a deadpan expression. So I'm just going to forge ahead.
Here's a list of some names you can call on if you need to.
Self-defense on Gordon's part. Self-defense on Gordon's part.
I did tell Ed to expect a flat crowd because that's what we do all day.
No, he didn't say flat crowd. He said perhaps not as interactive as you might like. So I'm treating this like a first-year history class where you have to work really hard. That's excellent. That's one of the points that I think they're trying to emphasize. Anything else that comes up over and over and over again, one of the reasons that you feel proud at the end?
The dream, for one thing.
Dream. You'd think we were being psychoanalyzed. The dream, national dream, vision of a nation, right?
There's a huge contrast at the end between what you saw at the beginning and the cultural diversity of the clips that are shown.
Yeah. Always careful.
Once the dream has been built.
At the university, whenever we do any advertising for the university, you can see people going around campus. Can you come over here? Can you pose for a picture? So that we show our diversity, even though the bulk of the population at UPI are Caucasian, white, and from Prince Edward Island. But same here. We make sure that we show what is true about Canada, the modern sort of a diversity. And it's all about vision. It's all about social bonds cementing together the vision of a nation. Excellent. That's actually what I had. So because I agree with you, I think you're quite brilliant. What's not there? What do you not see there? Mr. McArdle?
Participation of the women.
We're going to talk about women later on. We are going to talk about women. But you're right.
You don't see disagreement.
Disagreement. Where's the conflict? So let's just... Prince Edward Island didn't join right away. It took a few years. It's true, isn't it? We minimized the discord and the conflict. And it minimized any other motive for forming, a confederation other than vision of a nation. It also doesn't mention that Canada, when it was formed, wasn't a nation anyway. It was a colony, a bigger colony, with the same rights and privileges as the smaller ones had. There's a march to nationhood, and when most of us were in school, that was the bedrock of the storyline of Canadian history, was the march to nationhood. And because most of it happened at the point of a pen, not the point of a sword, it put a lot of us to sleep. So we need to talk about the women. We need to talk about who's not at the conference. We need to talk about who's not represented. But the point is, we don't talk about conflict here. What group of people did you get to meet in the film, other than the girl I went to university with, Pam Stevenson, who plays, the housekeeper? Who did you meet by name?
Sir John.
John A. McDonald, Cartier,
George Brown.
George Brown, and Pope, the Pope of Prince Edward Island, an ironic name because he was known and hated by the Catholics of Prince Edward Island because he manipulated the Protestants in their fear of the Catholics to win elections. But he was Pope. They had their revenge. I'll get to that later. We meet one islander, nobody from Nova Scotia, nobody from New Brunswick. Where are the Tillies? Oh, I see one with the Levecchios. It's about the Canadians, isn't it? It's a storyline about how the Canadians came down to Charlottetown and talked the Maritimers into forming a great nation.
Hijacked the meeting.
Hijacked the meeting. And
Nothing's changed.
I will.
You know what's particularly interesting, and nothing's changed, as I see that here. Until you start serving them booze, you can't get anywhere. But once the drinking starts, you can persuade them into anything.
Actually, we're going to come to that as well. There's something to be said for alcohol as a social lubricant. The dicey point is how much. Because as we all know, too much can have the opposite effect. After a few drinks, everybody loves one another. After 10 or 20 drinks, they're squaring off out in the alley.
Yeah, but we sent down John A. McDonald, and he had a pretty large capacity.
We're going to get to that as well. Poor John A. McDonald. What does any Canadian know about John A. McDonald other than the fact that he had a big nose and was homely? That he was a big drinker. Our first prime minister was a drunk. And we're proud of it. Or at least indulgent of it. I was at a paper this year at the Congress about the attempt to make him into an icon in Canadian history and how in the 60s it ran up against the intransigence of Quebecois, that he wasn't a hero for Francophones in Canada. But we're going to talk about Sir John A. as a drunkard. That's one of the hidden facts of Confederation. I've scattered 10 things you didn't know about Confederation. Now, I also have, because I do this all the time, notes to myself about when to show the next slide. So I may have to occasionally look at my notes. This is in which, I'm sorry.
How did they come up with the name Canada?
Well, Canada was the name of the colony in the central part of the continent occupied by Quebec and Ontario. And Canada was an early native word, and you may have seen the vignette on TV, which is entirely fictional, but where Jacques Cartier is listening to the know-it-all who says that Canada is the name of the country when actually, and it was probably an Iroquoian kind of chief saying, "Come to the village." So it's a name for the village. But again, the tail didn't wag the dog in Canada. Ontario and Quebec weren't the tail, but Canada being the larger part of the Union, it became accepted fairly early on that the larger Union would be Canada, not some new name, although they tossed around a few. And the Dominion of Canada selected because they thought the Americans would be insulted if we called it the Kingdom of Canada. And so Sir John A. MacDonald apparently was looking in the Bible and he found a passage about a dominion from sea to sea, and it fit the vision that he had. Oh, it was Leonard Tilley who they found the passage. Well, of course it would be Leonard Tilley. He knew the Bible probably better than John A. MacDonald. I'm sorry, there's a hand up there.
Was Newfoundland ever involved in any of this?
Not in Charlottetown. It was at Quebec, and we're going to talk about Newfoundland and Prince Edward Island and why we didn't give a fig to join Confederation. In their case, a codfish. A cod fig, maybe. So we're going to talk about, I want to talk a little bit because I'm an historian and you've seen the film, so you've seen the best parts of the story. So I have to find things to tell you about. I want to talk a little bit about the prisms of history. One of the things anybody can do history, right? It's not rocket science. But history is an art. The problem with history is that what we're interested in the past and what we go looking for and how we view the evidence is inevitably shaped by the filters that we're looking through in the present. And the interpretation of what happened in Charlottetown in 1864 has changed over time. And the things we're interested in have changed over time because of the concerns that we have looking back. So the glasses that we wear affect how we see the past. It's not some immutable repository of facts that if we could just get at them, we've uncovered the story. If it was, we'd all be out of work because there are a limited number of stories and limited number of facts. So we're going to talk a little bit about interpretation. We're going to talk about what's the real driver for Confederation, because I would put it to you that it was not a vision of a nation stretching from sea to sea to sea, although that vision existed. We're going to talk a little bit about the players. I'm a PEI historian, and I noticed the only one that they talked about was, Pope, W.H. Pope. Otherwise, it was the Canadians who are the architects of Confederation, which is true only in part. The conference, and then, of course, you can't just end with the conference in Charlottetown, as this does, because it's a province house sort of film. They go, oh, and they had a conference in Quebec, and then one in London, and then Canada was born. Drink up. Time to go home. We're going to talk a little bit about why Newfoundland was not interested in Confederation, why Prince Edward Island stayed out, why New Brunswick and Nova Scotia were largely against the idea but ended up part of it. That actually takes 3 classes in history, 232 rather, and so I'll make that short. And I want to talk about the commemoration of the event, because it is not a given. It was never a given that Charlottetown, this is September the 1st, this is the anniversary of the beginning of the conference 145 years ago. In fact, the, 150, sesquicentennial? I can never figure that out because I didn't take Latin. Sesquicentennial is coming up in 2014. And I want you all to come back because we're going to do something really big, I hope. I want to talk about commemoration because we weren't always the cradle of Confederation. That's a storyline that emerged over time. Napoleon, I think, said, of history, it's a lie agreed upon. Well, Voltaire, they attribute it to Napoleon, to Voltaire, that history is written by the winners. Well, it's not a lie agreed upon. And then I'll have a little conclusion which is going to put the ball back in your lap. So what? Because there are 3 questions in history. When you come right down to it, 3 questions in history. What happened? Why did it happen? And why should we care? And so that's what we're going to do today. Now, was any of that in my notes? Blah, blah, blah. Why in the 18... Okay, there's nothing inevitable about Confederation or even who would be the partners in it. But there's plenty of good reason to think that sooner or later Confederation would have happened. What I want to explore a little bit in this talk, in the 2 hours that we have, is why the 1860s, why this conference in Charlottetown, and why was this meeting so instrumental? Why is this the cradle of Confederation by resolution passed in Parliament in the last 15 years or so? And I want to get at a little bit of the hidden story and tell you maybe a few things that you don't know. Was there anyone here who majored in history in university? A limited, no. I'm just trying to gauge how long ago it was, because, I mean, if I tell some of this stuff to other historians, they're just going to go, can I Twitter in here? Have I got good? So this may be new to some of you, which is good. That's good. I was at a meeting of the Confed Center. They have a task force on the national mandate of the Confed Center, which is part of the commemoration bit here. And they were talking about interpretation in 2014 and what to do for 2014. And one of the members, David, I think he was from Ontario. I don't want sure. He said, "We need more scandal. We need a publication that talks about scandal." Well, we could talk about Georgette Cartier's alleged mistress. We could talk about Charles Tupper allegedly being a womanizer. although the evidence for that is apparently quite flimsy. To be charming and to like the company of women is not to be a womanizer. But, so there'll be a little bit of scandal, just around the fringes about some of the characters that you may not know. So here is British North America in 1866, just in case you're not familiar with the contours of Canada. There was a flap a few years ago when there was a tourism map that managed to leave the island out entirely. It's apparently a typographical misprint. What do you think, this is a note to myself, ask the audience, what do you think were the most pressing causes for Confederation? We've already put one on the table because the film put it on the table. A vision of something greater.
Large Union Army.
Fear of the Americans. Fear is a great motivator. And fear of the Americans is one of the reasons for the timing, one of the key reasons for the timing of Confederation. As you may or may not know, between 1861 and 1865, the United States was riven by a bloody civil war between the Confederate South and the Union North. And British North Americans were split in their own loyalties. There was sympathy for the South, but most of the Canadians who, and I use that in the later term of people living in British kind of America, most of the Canadians that enlisted in the Northern Army, and many of them did. Many people from Prince Edward Island, a surprising number from Prince Edward Island enlisted in the Union Army. But they were tearing the country apart. Britain, because it needed the cotton from the Confederacy to run the cotton mills of the industrial Midlands, tended to sympathize with the Confederacy, and there was nearly war. There was very nearly war between the British and the Americans in 1862. And people were worried that when the Civil War was over and the Union by 1864 looked like it was going to win, that with the most modern, well-equipped army in the Western world, the United States may just say, well, it was a good day's work. What do we do now? Oh yeah, Britain. They were helping out the Confederacy, the rebels. Just maybe the United States might invade. It had happened before, twice.
What had happened with respect to when was the Oregon acquisition and Maine? Like, when did British North America lose?
Those are pre-American Civil War. Maine before, I can't remember when the Aroostook War was exactly, but middle decades or the first 2 decades, I'm going to say 1820s and 30s. Oregon, I think a little bit later, 1840s, I think, but I would have to go look it up. So the great thing about when you're an historian is you don't have to know it, you just have to be able to know where to find it. I can go find that. But there had been a series of tensions. The point is that between the War of 1812, which did happen in 1812. It's not a trick question on the exam. There were a series of tensions, including those revolving around the rebellions in the Canadas in 1837 and 38. So there was tension with the United States. Most recently, they had come to the verge of war. Now, by 1866, it was clear the Americans were not going to invade us, but by that time, there was a fear of the Fenians, and I'm going to talk about the Fenians in a second. I published an article about the Fenian scare in Prince Edward Island 2 weeks ago, and most people aren't aware that there was a Fenian scare in Prince Edward Island, but there was. So, fear of the Americans, a vision of a nation, or a vision of something larger than the petty, the parochial, the humdrum, the boundedness of living in one colony. Anything else that you can think of? I do have more slides, don't worry. I wonder what the next slide is, actually. Oh yeah, there's the Fenians right there. People laughed at the Fenians, but it was nervous laughter. Why else do you think we should form a country? You're doing very well, by the way, giving the lie to the idea that a judge won't venture an opinion unless they're paid.
We religion.
Religion, indirectly. Now, when we get to the motives for individual colonies wishing to have a federation, Quebec, for example, was seeking a divorce from Ontario. They were locked in a loveless union, a legislative union between Canada West and Canada East, and religion played into the francophone identity. And I do want to apologize. Je regrette que je parle un peu de français seulement. So this is going to be a presentation in English. But although I'm told my accent isn't bad, but that gets you in trouble in stores in Montreal because then people think you can speak French. Economics. Now, I took some economics, and I confess that it wasn't the most riveting subject, but over and over and over again, economics plays in to history. And there is economic reasons, part of the attraction of Confederation. So, religion is going to be a factor, but it's not a pan-British American factor for or against the Confederation movement. Depending on where you lived, a Catholic, for example, might be anti-Confederation or for Confederation. Economics is a factor, especially for colonies which are part of the mainland of North America, because one of the great projects of the mid-1800s was the construction of the intercolonial railway that would link the Canadas to the Maritimes, so that in the wintertime, when the main artery for communication and transport was filled with ice, the St. Lawrence River and Gulf, transportation could still move smoothly and swiftly. One of the problems with building an intercolonial railway was that you had to have agreements among all of the partners, all of the colonies involved, and the attempt to finance and to cooperate and to get support from the British for an intercolonial foundered. And it was thought that it would be easier to get support from the British to guarantee the loans that we would need to get if we were one colony instead of a number. So economics is part of it. You're missing one important one. And it has to do with kids living in perhaps in the homes of their parents. Okay, it's not a great analogy, but somebody else, who's pushing who? Someone is pushing people in the Maritimes, and there's someone who's pushing people in Canada and the Maritimes. Great Britain. Our parents didn't want us anymore. I know. We were loyal members of the British Empire, and Britain appreciated that. We professed our love for Britain all the time, like children should, even though we wanted a measure of autonomy. But for Britain, our colonies were damned expensive. Expensive to administer, expensive to defend. And they weren't getting the payback that they wanted. Now, without getting too far back into history, colonies in Western Europe were founded on a mercantilist idea that the colony existed for the benefit of the mother country. They were a market for your goods in a closed trading kind of arrangement, a source of raw materials, and an outlet for population that you didn't need anymore. But Britain was all about free trade in the mid-1800s. Its economy straddled the world. They had industrialized before anybody else. They had a head start, a huge head start. Their economy was dominant. Within 25 years it wouldn't be, and they'd be running scared, but they were dominant. And so they didn't want closed trading systems. They didn't need a colony to guarantee them a market. So colonies had lost their economic reason, and they were expensive to defend, especially with angry Americans next door. So Britain thought they could achieve more efficiency, not by throwing us out of the family, but getting us to all move in together and pay for our own kind of household expenses. So if you had one colony instead of a number of colonies, they could defend themselves and pay more cost, if not the entire cost of their defense, and the cost of administering their governments. So the Colonial Office couldn't openly order us to unite. The Colonial Office couldn't blackmail us into uniting, but it could and did press all the levers of influence that it had to convince the colonies that union was a good idea. And of course, the other individual involved in pushing was Canada itself, Canada West and East. And again, that's a whole 2 lectures about the legislative union, the union of the Canadas, representation by population being thwarted by sectional equality, the need for governments that commanded a majority of members from Canada West as well as East. Governments rose and fell in Canada in the 50s and 60s like Italy. Not any disrespect to the Italians, but in post-World War II Italy, as you know, has seen, until recent times, a revolving door of governments because no one's been able to command a majority. That was happening in Canada. Quebec and Ontario, as they're going to exist, hated being part of the same union. Each felt thwarted by the other for cultural and political reasons, and they wanted to redraw the playing field. The way to break the deadlock in the Canadas was to redraw the playing field, to redraw the political landscape. That's why George Brown, who loathed John A. MacDonald, George A. Brown had more rectitude than laugh lines. And John A. MacDonald, to his mind, was one of those plausible, affable, dishonest, unreliable, unprincipled rogues. And more infuriating still, people liked him. George Brown was willing, the leader of the Grit Party, the leader of the essentially Liberal Party in Canada West, agreed to a coalition with John A. MacDonald. A temporary solution because they had one platform, and that was to seek a union of British North America so that they wouldn't have to put up with one another anymore. John A. MacDonald, of course, had the alliance with the Bleu Party in Quebec, a conservative, church-supported, if not church-sanctioned party, which controlled the majority of votes in Canada. I'm sorry, get my east and west. That's the eastern part of Canada, Canada East. And of course, the most prominent member of their partnership at the time, Georges-Etienne Cartier. So Georges Cartier, no relation, I think, to Jacques Cartier, and I don't think he's any relation to the guy that makes the watches. But as far as I know, they're pushing Confederation. And it is true. The conference that was held in Charlottetown was held to discuss maritime union. Not because, unlike what the film implies, not because the governments of the Maritimes were interested in maritime union. There was minimal interest to no interest. But the governors of the colonies in the Maritimes, following instructions from the Colonial Office, they were keen on maritime union, and they're the ones who pushed the idea of a conference. And Canada invited itself to the conference. And it's like the salesman who arrives at your door with a suitcase full of samples and is going to sell you a better vacuum cleaner. Those are the drivers. Fear of the Americans. The Canadians seeking a new political solution to their problems. There's some dispute about this. Back in the 60s, it was observed Confederation was a Canadian solution for a Canadian kind of issue or problem. There's some dispute about that now, but I think it still holds true. The Colonial Office in Britain, fear of the Americans, and around the edges, a national vision. But we sell the vision today. We sell the sauce on the sizzle, not the steak. So who are the players? You know something that I like to remind other people? Oh, I'm sorry. En question.
Is
So,
the Aboriginal community part of this equation in any way?
going to get to them. See, you guys, you're anticipating. Saying, this is week 3 of the course. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the players. See, I put this off. This is like your parents, right? Say, when are we going to? We will, just, wait. And then we're kind of hoping you'll have a nap and fall asleep. No, I am going to speak about these. I want to show you some of the players. In the film, you saw mostly Canadians. Canadians carry the ball in the film. And the Canadians are the ones, who do you know? What fathers of Confederation can you name?
Henry?
John A. McDonald. Henry, okay. Leonard Tilley. Charles Tupper. George Cole. That's Islander. That was an Islander who said that.
John Hamilton Gray and John Hamilton Gray.
Islanders, be quiet. You're ruining my point, which is that people don't know about. Darcy McGee.
Peter Mitchell.
Peter Mitchell. Joseph Howe was not a father of Confederation, although he's in my slideshow. An excellent point, because how do you get to be a father of Confederation? Half of the fathers of Confederation opposed union. Only in Canada can people who are against an idea be credited by us afterwards as being fathers of Confederation. But the ones that come immediately to mind, and the ones whose faces we recognize, you people are more informed than the average run-of-the-mill Canadian, and these Islanders with their strong historical bent came out with some Islanders. John A. McDonald, this is him about 1861. I picked it because it's flattering to him. Let's see. Poor John A. By the way, it's unfortunate John A. McDonald was a small d McDonald. Anyone who lives on Prince Edward Island knows that the proper way to spell McDonald is M-A-C with a big D. But I digress. Yes?
What is cabinet builder?
He allegedly, on a visit to Province House, probably when he was here convalescing from convalescing from gallstones in 1870. He stayed for months on Prince Edward Island. And apparently he came as a visitor to Province House and he signed the guest book, and that's what he put down as occupation.
Oh,
Because he was Prime Minister. Thank you for catching that. So he's a cabinet maker. Did I ever tell you about John A. McDonald's park there in Kingston? About it being accosted twice at night by, let's say, I guess, maybe for later. George Etienne Cartier, one of the interesting things, English spelling of George. A great admirer of the British parliamentary tradition, and in some ways an ancestor of Laurier, in some important ways in terms of the kind of philosophy that he had. George Etienne Cartier, having read in the Globe and Mail about his mistress, that's her behind the curtain. George Brown, who, except in letters to his wife, was not a mush. What did she call him in the column? Bucket? Mush bucket? Yeah, right. George Brown actually shot to death. No, he was the owner of the Globe, and an unstable former employee came in and shot him in the leg, and ultimately he died of it. I think it was in the leg. Anyway, that happened later. And Darcy McGee. Even though Darcy McGee doesn't really do anything, everybody likes Darcy McGee. He was the most eloquent of the fathers, perhaps the most visionary of the fathers, and the only Canadian political leader to be assassinated in the 1800s, certainly, at least at the national level. Played in the film by Urban Carmichael, the late Urban Carmichael. And a few people will come up with Galt, A.T. Galt, financier, railwayman, wealthy. He thought big as well. But thank you for coming up with the two prime architects of Confederation in the Maritimes, Charles Tupper. And I picked this picture as well because it's 1864. Leonard Tilley. Both of whom were premiers of their colonies at the time of the conference. But what about, I want to talk about, because we're on Prince Edward Island and I'm an islander and I teach island history, some of the PEI Fathers of Confederation. There were 5 of them at the conference in Charlottetown, 2 more at Quebec. This is Edward Whalen, the editor and owner of the Charlottetown Examiner, the acknowledged leader of the Catholic Irish on Prince Edward Island, and the indispensable ally of the Liberal leader on Prince Edward Island. Edward Whalen published the speeches that were recorded at the conferences. He wasn't at Charlottetown, he was at Quebec, and he fell in love. After initially distrusting this idea of union, he fell in love with the idea of union, and it cost him his political career. But to hear that full story, I have an article in the Island magazine about him and his last election campaigns. He was described in his obituary as a fast liver. That can only mean one thing. He was a drinker. But he was a brilliant man, probably the most able figure in the journalistic history of PEI. And I hope that's not setting the bar too low. He supported Confederation, his party did not, and that in part led to the defeat in a by-election in 1867, which, according to local lore, led to his decline, and he died allegedly of a broken heart because of the rejection by the voters who had elected him for 20-some years. I tend to think it wasn't a broken heart.
That's from the Island Hymn, isn't it?
No, that's a poem. Actually, it's quite similar to the Island Hymn, but that's a poem in memory of Edward Whalen, published in the 1880s, which is when that engraving was published. I just happen to have it on file. George Coles, Ben. George Coles, the father of Confederation, one of the fathers of Confederation who opposed it resolutely, almost from the beginning to the end. He was the premier, the first of the premiers of Prince Edward Island when government became finally responsible. He was the first to introduce free education to the people of British America on Prince Edward Island. He was an amazing man. Hidden fact number 1. Who were the only 2 fathers of Confederation ever to fight a duel that I know of? Well, here's one of them, George Coles, who was a self-educated man, the son of a farmer, self-educated man, became a brewer, and he was a distiller and a property owner. When he became the premier, he was attacked in the house, and there was an implication that he was not a gentleman. And there was one way, although it was illegal, to prove that you were a gentleman. And he issued a challenge to a duel with the leader of the opposition. Now, I would love to see this happen today on Prince Edward Island. It could be the solution to some of our problems. Edward Palmer, Neddy Longlegs, as he was known around town, because he was tall and thin and humorless. And I did an article about this years ago, and an artist friend of mine did the cover illustration for it. George Coles, they fought in government, farm out in Victoria Park. Edward Palmer was later accused of firing before the signal. He did not, but he did get to fire first. He shot and he missed. George Coles, having proven that he was a gentleman, raised his pistol and shot it in the air. Yes, if this were in Los Angeles in 1995, we'd say, in your face. Oddly, both of these people would become fierce opponents of Confederation. And George Coles' life ends in tragedy. So this is all of this is hidden fact number 1, but it's bonus sort of hidden fact number 1. Beginning in 1866, he began suffering from deep depression, which developed into a dementia. He was convinced he was going to lose everything and his family would starve. And when he started to imply that he would rather see the family dead than ruined and starved, his family put him in the insane asylum, where, given the knowledge of how to treat mental illness at the time, he suffered tortures. And he ended up being essentially a prisoner of his own home, in his own home. And he died without ever being able to recover his senses in 1875. So a real island tragedy. Let me just check my notes. Oh yeah! Okay, we're going to get to this. Question someone asked, where are the women? Where are the mothers of Confederation? This is an illustration from a lady's book from 1866. Where are the women? And this is the picture of the ball that prompted the comment in the column about the Moira Gray, was that the name of the columnist? If she came to Province House and saw the painting, she couldn't have watched the film, or she might have found out something about where the women were. Anyway, and where were the native peoples? I'd love to be able to say this is a scene from the conference in Charlottetown, but the conference was largely ignored. This is the visit of the Prince of Wales in 1860, the first time that the Prince of Wales had ever come, that any member of the British royal family who was heir to the throne had ever come to Prince Edward Island. It was the first time any member of the royal family come to PEI, and attracted huge crowds. According to local legend, possibly fathered an illegitimate child who went on to become a very successful novelist in the United States in the early 1900s, named Basil King, who bore an uncanny resemblance to King George V. But that's all supposition. Entirely supposition. But they trotted out some Mi'kmaq for the prince to see, because they were exotic. But neither women nor Aboriginal peoples enter into the discussions in Charlottetown over the Confederation issue. They're present around the fringes. They're the adornment. They're the ones that you dance with. They're the ones that you charm. They're the ones that George Brown writes letters to, one of the only first-hand reports of what happened at the conference. George Coles had a daughter who went to Quebec, and she gives a lively social account of the conference at Quebec and falling ill, and John A. MacDonald and coming to visit her at her bedside and being very charming.
I wondered what happened after the parties were over.
John A. MacDonald was a very kind man. But women are disenfranchised. As you know, women don't have the vote. In British law extended to North America, what is the legal status of a woman in 1864? She's a chattel good of her husband. She's not legally a person. She certainly doesn't have the vote. Any influence that she's going to exercise over Confederation, and the storyline for Confederation, remember, until recently, the storyline for Confederation is a political storyline. I remember giving some remarks once at a picnic where people had to pretend to be a father and give an argument for or against union, and I was supposed to choose a winner and assess them, and I gave some remarks and I didn't pick a winner. And a woman, she came up to me afterwards and she said, "I noticed you only talked about the fathers of Confederation. You didn't talk about women." And I said, "Well, that's because women didn't have any political authority." She said, "I think it reflects a problem on your part." And I said, "Well, maybe I do have gender issues or bias that I'm not aware of, but it certainly wasn't intentional. It's just that women weren't part of the discussions and didn't have a chance to vote." And she said, "No, I think you have a problem." So I'm very sensitive to this issue. Women's accounts give texture to the events of Confederation, and they make them live. And that's what comes out in the column in the Globe and Mail.
Was that your wife who said that?
No, she doesn't go to any of my talks. and with good reason. But they're absent from the discussions of Confederation. Their point of view is lacking, and we have no evidence that George Brown had any advice from his wife. But George, here's what to say. We have no evidence George Coles was told what to do by the daughter Mercy Coles. No evidence that when George Brown met the Pope family and spent a great evening with them, he said they've got kids like steps on the stairs. And the girls are all sharp as needles. None of them said, well, you know, I think you should have a federal union instead of a legislative union. They don't have a say. Maybe the country would be a better country today if they had a say. And Native peoples, it doesn't enter for a moment into anybody's mind that Native peoples should have any say in the formulation of a political union. There is cultural racism, there's overt racism, there are European ethnocentric assumptions of civilization, superiority. Native peoples do not have a legal status as nation makers. They're not consulted. When Prince Edward Island, and maybe we shouldn't get into this because this could end up in the courts, when Prince Edward Island was transferred by the French to the British, there was no reference made at all to Native peoples. No treaty had been made with them. The property had never been acquired from them. The island was assumed to be empty. So Native peoples are not consulted in Confederation because no one feels that they have a political voice that is worth listening to or that needs to be listened to. In fact, the prevailing opinion on Prince Edward Island with respect to the Native peoples in 1864 is that they're going to become extinct. Like an animal that loses its habitat, that they would just become extinct. They'd fade away, or they would have to become like us. They would have to be assimilated, learn to become farmers, and settle down. We didn't even have a reservation for Aboriginal peoples on Prince Edward Island until the 1870s. By the way, any questions as we go, please continue to throw them in. Why Charlottetown? Because it's so lovely. This is not one of the more complimentary images of Charlottetown. This is a painting from 1849 of Queen Square, where you just were. I mean, of all the bars and all the gin joints in the world, why would you have a constitutional conference in Charlottetown? Film didn't explain that, did it? Hidden fact number 2. Why Charlottetown? I think that's hidden fact number 2. Why was the Charlottetown conference held in Charlottetown? Some of the islanders may know this. Ross Goodwin. No, sorry, just kidding. Why was it held in Charlottetown? I suppose you could say, why not? But
Otherwise, they would have had to change the name.
yes, that's right. Then we would have had to call it the Halifax Conference. And Nova Scotia, by the way, has been trying to horn in by saying there was a Charlottetown Conference, a Halifax Conference, a Quebec Conference, and a London Conference. Poppycock. They did nothing in Halifax. They adjourned, and they met in Halifax and said, let's meet in Quebec. It was a conference in Maritime Union, but why was the conference in Maritime Union being held in Charlottetown?
Because they couldn't choose Nebraska or Nova Scotia.
These are good reasons. Not easy, well, not easy, well, easy to get to in the summer. You could say, well, wouldn't you want to come to Charlottetown? Like the weather David arranged for yesterday, golfing at Crowbush and 15-degree weather that felt like 6 above with clouds. Travel was mainly by sea. Prince Edward Island was easy to reach in the summer. It was cut off virtually in the wintertime by ice flows. If we had solid ice, it wouldn't have been an issue, but there were shifting ice flows with the combination of open water and lolly flows, small icebergs, all moving through the strait. So it was essentially we were isolated in the winter. But in September, no problem. You know why we met in Charlottetown? Because if we hadn't, Islanders would not have attended the conference. There was so little interest in maritime union on Prince Edward Island that the motion by the government to appoint people to attend the conference was nearly lost on debate in the House, because no one could see any point in spending money to send people to a conference on maritime union when everybody agreed that Prince Edward Island was not interested in maritime union, and the Premier had to intervene and make it kind of a party vote, or the motion would have been lost. And in fact, it was the delegates from New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, who said, well, we'll come to Charlottetown then. So it was held here because otherwise we wouldn't have attended. There's a ringing endorsement for Confederation. We are the cradle of Confederation because we wouldn't have gone anyplace else for a meeting on the subject. That's not in the film. You can see why. Donald Creighton. You've heard of Donald Creighton? Did the biography of John A. MacDonald, one of the leading historians in Canada from the 30s through the 60s, lived to be 137 or something like that. Came here in the early 60s to research a book on Confederation. He called it The Road to Confederation, and he described the city in the book basically as a dusty backwater. Does this look like a dusty backwater to you? Mount Edward Road, by the way, for those of you from Prince Edward Island. Ravenwood, home of J.C., one of the Pope, the family, a brother to, the father of Confederation. I can't use my, cursor. But do you recognize this building on the right? Ardgowan. It's Ardgowan, home of William Henry Pope, who entertained George Brown and the Fathers of Confederation at the conference. Ravenwood, which is the headquarters or the home of the superintendent of the Charlottetown Experimental Farm, which has now been closed. Doesn't look too dusty to me, of course. Well, it was pretty dusty, but then wasn't every place. Water Street, this is from about 1865. Most of these buildings are gone. This one's still there. The Bonded Warehouse. Queen Square, with one of the gas lights. The city was lit by gas. If you walk to the corner of Queen Street in Grafton today, you'll still see the cannon, which was erected in honor of the visit of the Prince of Wales in 1860. This is the Market House, by the way, designed by Isaac Smith, the same guy, by John Plough, who trained Isaac Smith. In actual fact, Charlottetown in 1873 was the 11th largest city in Canada. We were number 11 with a bullet. Dusty backwater indeed. Dusty backwater.
We slipped a few notches since
we have slipped. Okay, we're now not in the top 20. But we were number 13 in 1855. So we had moved up to number 11 by 1873, which I think is not bad. But it goes to show that for us looking back at a little town with 7,500 people in 1864, that sounds like a dusty little backwater. But in the context of British America, it was a bustling commercial hub. And here, of course, is where it all happened. This is all context, setting. I had to alter this slide after I got here this morning because I realized that when you go up the stairs, you turn around, so it's up the stairs and to your right, end of the hall, Confederation Chamber. It was much smaller than I thought it would be when I came here first. I thought our legislature would be much larger, and I thought the Confederation Chamber would be, Room of Destiny, as there was a film made about it in about 1964. That's what they called it. Room of Destiny. Lovely engraving. I think that's from the Illustrated London News, but I'm not sure. I was glad to see that the film got this right, because Rex Woods, who did this on commission from Confederation Life in 1964, got it wrong. What's happening here? William Henry Pope meeting John A. McDonald. So if you go drinking, I know judges don't drink, but if you did and you went down to the quay, you would go to a bar down at the quay at Peaks Quay, and their sign has on it engraved an image of William Henry Pope rowing out to the Queen Victoria. Hidden fact number 3, William Henry Pope. The ablest, the wiliest, and most consistent ally of Confederation on Prince Edward Island. And in fact, this is the beginning of a long association. William Henry Pope is a very interesting guy. So my hidden fact is to tell you more about William Henry Pope, the only islander mentioned in the film. And why is he mentioned? Because he rode out to meet the Canadians. Because the Canadians are the important ones, you see. Not that we have any resentment. Here, don't. If that comes through in my voice, don't worry. That's why he enters into the story. Now, William Henry Pope's father was a shipbuilder and merchant, a prominent political leader on Prince Edward Island. In fact, he outlived his sons. And William Henry Pope was a lawyer and an extremely intelligent, extremely well-read man. He was widely feared because he was basically the brains behind the Tory party, but he was not widely respected on Prince Edward Island because his career got off to a kind of bad start. In 1853, the government of Prince Edward Island passed a Purchase Act whereby the government could purchase large estates from landowners who chose to sell, and then sell those estates in farm-sized lots to the people that actually lived on the lots. Because on Prince Edward Island, we had a land question, which one of the only things other people know about in our history. On Prince Edward Island, early on, we got locked into a leasehold system of landholding rather than freehold, meaning people had a tough time buying farms. They had to rent them, lease them, from landlords who received 20,000-acre lots in 1767. So they got 20,000-acre estates, which they were supposed to settle and didn't, supposed to pay a tax on and didn't, but maintained ownership of. So the government passed an act to sort of enable it to purchase the estates of landlords that were willing to sell. William Henry Pope was the land agent for the Worrell family, who had lived on Prince Edward Island in Morel, owned 80,000 acres in the eastern part of PEI in the Crowbush area where you golfed, lived in a kind of a decaying sort of mansion that would have been built there in the 1790s, had moved back to England, were not collecting much rent from their estate, and were willing to sell. Well, among the agents sent to London to negotiate the purchase was William Pope's father-in-law. And William Pope's father-in-law, after convincing the Worrells to sell, then apparently with no evidence told them that the government no longer was interested in buying their property. However, William Pope, his land agent, would buy it. And he bought it for 14,000 pounds, I believe, and then turned around and sold it to the government for 25,000 pounds. The property that he had bought from the Worrells on the advice of his father-in-law, with the financial support of his father-in-law to raise the money, he turned around and sold to the government, and the government was forced to buy because it was public knowledge that they were going to buy the Worrell estate. And if they hadn't gone ahead and done it, it would have been a huge disaster. So William Henry Pope, it was called the Worrell job. And it blackened his reputation for the rest of his career, which is a little bit unfortunate. No one ever has done that before or since in Prince Edward Island. He was not enamored, he was not loved by Catholics because for 3 consecutive elections, he was the architect of an electoral strategy which argued that if we were to prevent the Catholics, who were the largest single group in the colony but not the majority, if we were going to prevent them from running the colony, all the Protestants would have to vote as a bloc to resist rule from Rome. A very successful electoral strategy, very divisive. Sectarianism came to the surface and it would be a bubbling problem for the next 20-some years. William Henry Pope engaged in newspaper exchanges with Catholic officials where he said things like the Jesuits assassinated people and that the host was just a little piece of bread. And anyway, just generally stoked the feud. Ironically, a daughter and a son and his wife converted to the Catholic faith after he died of a heart attack at a young age, leaving them financially insolvent because he liked to do things like entertain all the fathers of Confederation. And he spent money like a millionaire, but he didn't earn it that way. His eldest son had to go out and work at a young age, and he ended up being the personal secretary to John A. MacDonald. Joseph Pope. Joseph Pope became the most senior civil servant in Ottawa and is credited with being co-founder of the National Archives and the Department of External Affairs. His son, Morris Pope, became a general in the Canadian Army and was secretary to the War Cabinet in World War II, and he was one of the experts advising the government and Mackenzie King that conscription wasn't necessary. We just had to try harder to get volunteers, which allowed him to steer his way through the conscription problem, the crisis of 1944 in World War II, by backstabbing his Minister of Defense, Ralston, sitting member for Prince Edward Island, by the way. Morris Pope in the Councils of the Mighty, all connected to William Henry Pope, who became a judge after Confederation, not as a reward for his political service. He was an extremely able judge. Why did Charlottetown succeed? What is the significance of the Charlottetown Conference? Slide of Joe Howe, not a father of Confederation, but the most famous man in Nova Scotia, Mr. Nova Scotia. What were the ingredients? What were the keys to success in Charlottetown? Well, one of the keys to success was engineered by the Maritimers. The Canadians were a coalition already, so both sides of the House were represented in the delegation that they sent to Charlottetown. In the Maritimes, it was actually the Tuppers and the Tillys who insisted that their delegation include the leading members of the opposition party, because it was a classic case of wanting them inside the tent rather than outside the tent. And so they ensured that potential critics and opponents of Confederation were co-opted into the process by inviting them to Charlottetown. Christopher Moore did a very fine book in the early 90s called 1867, How the Fathers Made a Deal. And the filter he was kind of looking through was the failure of the Charlottetown Accord. Why did the Fathers succeed in 1867? Why did the Charlottetown Accord fail? And he was looking for clues. That was one of the clues that he came up with. Both sides of the House represented at the conference. Joseph Howe was not present at Charlottetown, and he had an ego almost as big as Nova Scotia. He had been talking about British North American Union for years at banquets, but he was left out of the discussions. He had some kind of assignment from the British office. I can't remember what exactly he was doing, but he wasn't available to go to the conference. And he became an inveterate critic of Confederation, the most influential and effective of the opponents in Nova Scotia. And he turned the people of the province against the idea. So there was, not because they deliberately excluded him, but because he wasn't there, that became an issue. So that's one of the reasons Charlottetown succeeded. The other is the one that you would think, looking at the film, that it succeeded because everybody got drunk together. Party! If you look at the schedule, actually, they generally met from, 9 or 10 to about 3. Not a bad working day. And then they did something fun. You would think, in this cocktail version of Confederation, that the delegates to Charlottetown mostly spent the week eating and drinking, and that our country was conceived in a soft haze of intoxication. Even that the Canadian Casanovas seduced the innocent Maritimers with champagne and oysters. And it's true that at a reception on board the vessel, they proclaimed the bans of marriage and asked if anyone had any objections. They had to speak now or forever hold their peace, and they proclaimed that Confederation was going to happen. Sure, but to say Confederation began as a banquet toast is like saying John A. MacDonald was a drunk. It catches the echo of the thing, but not the essence. I'm reading here from an article that I wrote. That's why I suddenly make sense. There were parties and balls and banquets and outings, and they were important. Conviviality was critical in fashioning friendships and potential alliances. Laurier-Lapierre, absolutely right. Quite simply, the delegates got to know one another, and that helped smooth the sharp edges of both their acquaintance and their project. But it's inaccurate to think that Charlottetown was a week's holiday interspersed with meetings. That was my conference this summer, actually in Copenhagen. Rather, the reverse is true. At the heart of the conference were the exploratory talks in the chamber, where they sketched out a rough plan for Confederation. The social round merely schooled all the delegates to like the plan. Hidden fact number 4. Speaking of drinking your way into union, what about John A. MacDonald's drinking? As I said, increasingly, all any of my students know about Sir John A. MacDonald was that he was supposed to have been a drunk. Actually, a scholar has investigated this issue, and he published a lengthy article about it. And here's the scoop. In an age when people either drank not at all or many people drank hard, John A. MacDonald was a hard drinker, especially early on in his political life. And there were periods in his political life when he was incapacitated by drink, usually periods of crisis, either a political crisis or personal crisis. Never incapacitated, I shouldn't say that, never in a crisis where he had to be like himself. But when things were going bad, he tended to drink. And it is true that it is entirely probable that during the Pacific Scandal of 1873, when John A. MacDonald was seeking to save his political career because he was being sucked into the scandal, not just his party, but John A. himself, and he made an incredible speech in the House that lasted for hours. It is probably true that he wasn't drinking water. It was a clear beverage that sustained him. Probably gin. But this is water. Honestly. It is. It is water. So, in the second half of his career, during the part of his career, after the early 1870s, John A. MacDonald drank less and less. And even during his drinking time, he wasn't drinking all of the time. He was a binge drinker. So that's not to say he didn't have a drinking problem, but he didn't have a drinking problem for his entire career that consumed his work life and made him incapable of being a leader. So, but you know what happens with history? There's a reductionism with history. My job is to complicate things, to provide the details and the if, ands, and buts and multiply the factors. But entertainment's job and tourism's job is to simplify things and to package things. And so even after everything I've said, you'll probably go back home and say, well, Ed MacDonald said John A. MacDonald was a drunk. Well, not quite. Anyway, private versus the public. Laurier-Lapierre mentioned in the film that we have no real idea who said what at the conference except from George Brown and newspaper accounts written on the strength of what other people leaked to them. The country was not negotiated in public, in front of the media or the masses. The tricky parts were all done in private. Today that's not possible because the people would not allow it. But it was undoubtedly a factor in 1864 in helping the fathers reach agreement. The delegates to the Charlottetown Conference didn't have to worry anyway about the public demanding to know. Can you imagine what E.T. would do with the Charlottetown Conference? Entertainment tonight. I don't watch that, of course. Anyway, it's a scary thought. They didn't have to worry. Islanders weren't riveted. They weren't listening ears to the keyhole, saying, my God, what are they talking about now? Because as you know, everybody was at the circus. So hidden fact number 5, and I have in my notes, this one you probably already know, the big attraction wasn't the conference, it was Slaymaker and Nichols circus, the first circus that had been on Prince Edward Island allegedly in 21 years. Probably actually even longer than that. And it was a big deal. They had a big tent set up in the downtown, and we actually now know exactly where the tent was. And they did have a troupe of performing monkeys and dogs and trick ponies and clowns. Now, be honest, if you had your choice, where would you be going? If you had your choice between being here with me and going to the exhibition, okay, let's not go too far down that road. Yes, Wonder, the pony, General Scott. And one of the editors was writing about, he was very much opposed to the circus. It was an immoral sort of event, encouraged drunkenness and rioting and brawling. But he seemed to have been inspired in part because while watching the circus go by, the clown made fun of him. So it was hard to compete with the circus. It was hard to get a room with the circus. It was hard to compete with the circus. Hidden fact number 6. Oh, I think I'm... Oh, yes. Oh, yes. The most famous photo opportunity in the political history of Canada. By the way, where's this photograph? Oh, sorry, you've already read the caption. At Government House. All my students think it was done at Province House. It was taken at Government House at 9 in the morning. One of the questions that really kind of haunts my life is Andre McDonald from Georgetown distantly a relative of mine, if you discount a few kind of illegitimacies? Not on his part. Was Andre McDonald waving to the camera or shielding his head from the sun? Why is John A. MacDonald sitting on the bottom step? I know what you're thinking. But we really don't know anything about the photographer. In fact, we've been trying to find out for the book that we're working on, Mr. Roberts, and nobody knows that there was supposed to be another photo op. R.R. McClellan, who had a shop down the street here on Great George Street, was supposed to come in the later part of the morning and take a group photo. And he didn't show up. I think he had a wedding. We have no idea. But he missed out on history. Another reason why Charlottetown succeeded, this is actually kind of the meat of my talk, by the way, despite all the jokery. One of the reasons that Charlottetown was such a success was because they stuck with the principles, not the details. They agreed in principle. In fact, they passed a motion that union was desirable if satisfactory terms could be reached. It's easy to support that kind of motion. That's like the proposal of marriage, but then the contract is worked out at Quebec. That's where the 72 resolutions were passed, which defined the terms of Confederation with some exactitude. That's where the delegates started falling out, because the devil's in the details. But Charlottetown was a great success because they agreed that a federal union with an upper house which would be appointed and a lower house which would be elected by population would be a good idea. Unfortunately, you can never just stick with the principles. Ultimately, you do have to work out the details. Hidden fact number 7. Guess what the delegates did on their day off? Not Sunday, because they weren't allowed to do anything on Sunday. They did go to the circus early in the conference, but they had one day where they essentially had the day off. Guess what they did on their day off? And I think this is very significant, although I think I'm the only one on Prince Edward Island who's ever tried to say this is a significant thing. Guess what they did on their day off? Close. They went sightseeing. They went to the North Shores. They went sightseeing, driving through the lovely pastoral landscape of Prince Edward Island to the North Shore. By the end of the 1860s, there's going to be the beginning of a tourism industry on Prince Edward Island. And guess what the basis of the tourism industry has been from the beginning of tourism on Prince Edward Island? Sightseeing across a pastoral, gentle landscape and heading for the beaches on the north shore of Prince Edward Island, long before Anne of Green Gables and Cavendish. The fathers of Confederation may, in fact, be the jump start to the tourism industry in Prince Edward Island. I say that only half as a joke. Already by 1864, this is the first time that we have some evidence that if you were going to show visitors around, what did you think they should see? And they did. And it's by 1868 we have the founding of the first of the tourism hotels and resorts on Prince Edward Island.
You went there by train or by carriage?
By horse and buggy? No train. We're going to get to the train. There's still no trains on PEI, but between now and then there has been history. This is Rex Wood's version of the Quebec conference based on a painting by Harris, by Robert Harris, which I'm saving for later, because it's, I think, hidden fact number 9. The heavy lifting was done at Quebec. So now we're getting towards the end, by the way. I may have to slow down because I'm freezing in this room. And the Quebec conference? In the legislative building, which burned later on. So there's a plaque on the site today. It's on the slopes of the upper town as you go down into the lower town. And the windows, I guess the building itself, I have seen a photograph of the building. The building was not as handsome, actually, as our legislature. But it was a substantial building, and it burned. There's a whole thing about whether Quebec should be the cradle of Confederation. And part of the reason it isn't is because Quebec doesn't really want to be known as the cradle of Confederation for various reasons. So this is where the heavy lifting was done. This is where the generalities were turned into details. This time Newfoundland was able to send some representatives. They were invited to our conference, but too late for them to be able to organize a delegation. I think. Yeah, take notes on this. This is part of the quiz at the end. This is actually a slide from one of my classes. This is the 72 resolutions in a nutshell. These became the basis of the B&A Act, which of course became the basis of the Constitution of Canada. So a federal union. John A. MacDonald and others wanted a legislative union, a unitary form of government, because they saw the example of the United States where they felt the states had too much autonomy and power, and so that led to a fracturing of their union. So in Canada they thought legislative union. The Maritimes wouldn't go for that. They didn't want to abandon all control to a country where the bulk of the population and the bulk of the seats were going to be in the center of the country. So they decided on a federal house. with local or provincial levels of government. But John A. and his allies did get their way in that the bulk of the powers were going to reside at the federal level. There would be 2 houses in the federal level of government, a Commons and a Senate. Lots of argument about how the senatorial seats would be divided up. Andrew A. McDonald from the island suggested they followed the American style, which was 2 or a set number from each of the colonies, regardless of size. There was no support for that. Even among the island delegates, there was no support for that. How they would be appointed or elected, or who would do the appointing. If they're supposed to be a representative of regional interest, should the province appoint them? Well, they end up being appointed by the federal level of government, and with sectional equality rather than by province. The distribution of the powers, the most important legislative powers and taxing powers, were reserved to the federal level of government. Both levels of government were allowed to do income tax if they wanted. Everyone thought that was a bad idea at the time. Residual powers left to the federal level of government, but very significantly for the ongoing history of Canada, of course, the provinces control education as well as healthcare, something that was not seen as requiring at that time a lot of interference from government or a lot of expenditure. And the federal level of government was going to compensate the provinces for losing the most lucrative forms of revenue. By the way, what was the most lucrative form of resource or it was the customs tax. I'm still trying to find the word for it. The customs taxes, that was where most of the money came from, the taxes that we charged on imports. So, the resolutions were agreed to. Again, we have no record of the debates, only the motions that were passed. The minutes are very sparse. Andrew A. McDonald actually kept a record of the debates, and that's the only record that we have from someone who was there taking notes at the time. I have a hidden fact number 8. A couple of trivia questions about the delegates. At Charlottetown, it's interesting that one delegate from the Maritimes was Catholic. Only one delegate, despite the fact that the Catholics were the largest single group probably in the region. And that was Andrew A. McDonald from Prince Edward Island, who also was the youngest of all the delegates. He was 35. Who was the last of the fathers to actually die? Who died last? I'll give you a hint, it's not Andrew A. McDonald. He's the second last of the fathers to die, I believe. It's one of the famous ones.
Tupper?
Charlie Tupper. Too stubborn to die. Okay, the delegates passed some resolutions. How does that become a country? What do you have to do? How do you get sanctioned to proceed with a confederation? How do you think it should be done? They've worked out a deal. How do you turn that into legislation or into union? What way should you proceed?
Go to England.
Well, England will have to pass an act. But do you just go based on the strength of agreement of a majority of the people that went as representatives of their province? Is that how you should do it?
You mean like a plebiscite?
Okay, there's an option. We could have a plebiscite. We could give people a chance to express an opinion.
They have to get it passed by their local parliaments.
Well, see, no one had really stipulated how exactly your colony would express its approval of the deal. The delegates' own support wasn't deemed sufficient. The people would have to, or the colony would have to approve it. No one thought of having a plebiscite, although later on in the 1800s they would have some plebiscites. There was a plebiscite, for example, on alcohol consumption in 1890s. But Did you just go back to the legislature in your colony and have a motion brought in the House and a vote? Or did you call an election and put the issue to the people and say, is Confederation what you want or not?
They didn't do that, did they?
No one called an election specifically on the Confederation issue, but some colonies had to have elections because the mandate was running out for their government, and they became essentially a Confederation election. Those that didn't have to have elections didn't call them. Now, in Canada, things went very smoothly. Generally, there was approval. The legislature approved the idea. There was a considerable critical rump among the Rouge, the Quebecois liberals. But no issue there. Canada was keen as nails to marry the Maritimes. In New Brunswick, the term of government was running out and they had an election. And the Confederates were thumped at the polls by a coalition which was basically united by little more than opposition to Confederation. In Nova Scotia, the people had mobilized opinion, Joseph Howe had mobilized opinion against the Confederation idea. Charles Tupper knew it would be suicidal to have an election. So Confederation's a non-starter, right? New Brunswick and Nova Scotia have got to be in, right? If they're not in, you can't have a union. Newfoundland and Prince Edward Island. On Prince Edward Island, it was said repeatedly, not one person in 100 were supportive of union. Because you see, in Newfoundland and Prince Edward Island, union didn't solve any of our problems. It took away power. It undermined our autonomy and our freedom of action, and I'm showing a picture of the Kelso, an island sailing ship, because 1864 just happened to be the crest of the golden age of the maritime economy, particularly on Prince Edward Island. We built more vessels on Prince Edward Island in 1864 and the following year than at any time before or afterwards, 129 and 130 vessels. We built over 3,000 vessels on Prince Edward Island between 1840 and 1880. Shipbuilding and agriculture were at the heart of our economy. We had free trade with the United States, markets in Britain. Our attitude, if it ain't broke, why fix it? We're going to give up power to a parliament in Ottawa where we will have a handful of seats. And what will we get in return? The big issue on Prince Edward Island was the land question, buying out those landlords who refused to sell their properties because the Purchase Act that was in force was voluntary. And the government didn't have the money to buy out even the proprietors willing to sell. So if the Canadians had offered money to buy out the absentee landlords and support for legislation to force landlords to sell, which is, this is the 1800s, and the property owner's rights are sacred. But if that was put on the table, Prince Edward Island might have thought about it. It was added, but only later, only after we decided against it. In 1866, well, first of all, we voted against it at the session when actually we met, our House met in 1865, and in 1866 we passed a motion saying that no terms could be introduced that would induce us to join union. In other words, it was never, never, never. In Newfoundland, they had a problem. It was called the French shore. Treaty rights were given to France to fish on was a sliding sort of a French shore, but at this point it's the western side of Newfoundland. And Newfoundlanders were not allowed to fish or settle there. And they wanted the French shore back. But Confederation didn't offer to get them the French shore back. Newfoundland's face was turned to Britain. All of his settlement was in the northeast. It was closer to Britain culturally and economically than it ever was to Canada, although it had a lively link to PEI. In fact, Joey Smallwood, by the way, is the grandson of an islander. That's a bonus hidden fact. The last of the fathers of Confederation was the grandson of a Prince Edward Islander who moved to Newfoundland. The two islands had nothing to gain, and they had special problems that Confederation would not solve. And yet they had much to lose. No wonder the issue was a non-starter. Ultimately, in Newfoundland, they had an election in 1869 fought on the issue of Confederation, and it was overwhelmingly rejected. On Prince Edward Island, as you know, I'll do Nova Scotia and New Brunswick first. What changed their mind in New Brunswick? A combination of things, too complicated a story to tell. But essentially, in New Brunswick, the alternative to union with the Canadians was building a railway to link the railways in the colony to Maine and fostering further trade with the United States. The British made sure that the government wouldn't be able to raise the money on the markets in London to pay for that extension to the railway. And of course, there was a Fenian scare. The Fenians, Irish Americans who had a plan to invade Canada and hold it for ransom to force the British to free Ireland. That's a simplified sort of a version, but it was a pretty simple sort of plan. We can't sail to Britain and attack you there, so we'll attack you in Canada, and that will either force you to free Ireland or suck off your troops to put us down in Canada, and then the Irish can rebel themselves. They were posturing on the borders of New Brunswick. They actually crossed over to a little island where there was a customs house in the middle of the night and took the flag. That was the invasion of New Brunswick. They got further in Canada, but the fear of the Fenians was paralyzing, multiplied by rumor and good press. Tens of thousands of well-trained, well-armed Irish Americans who were going to invade a country that had a little half-trained kind of a militia and virtually no British regular army troops. It helped scare New Brunswick into Confederation. In Nova Scotia, the Fenian scare helped the Premier introduce a motion into the House at the end of the session, which basically said, the terms at Quebec are not good enough, but if better terms could be obtained, then this House is in favor of Confederation. And that's essentially the motion passed as well in New Brunswick, because there was support for Confederation in both the places. It was a minority support, but support because it could lead to the construction of a railway which would expand their trade, they felt. We always think in the Maritimes we're going to go out to conquer the rest of the world. So we build the pathways and then the rest of the world uses them to come in and conquer us. But there was some support, and so Nova Scotia passed a resolution in the House saying if better terms could be obtained, they had given support for Confederation. And so the delegates went to London in 1866 and improved the terms that much. But the resolution didn't say how much the terms had to be improved. And so Nova Scotia walked into the Confederation. In New Brunswick, the government, there was a coalition. It fell because of the collapse of the policy it had undertaken to build the railway extension. There was a new election in the middle of the Fenian scare. And the Confederates won. Some said they won because that there was money pumped into the campaign by the Canadians. That was a factor. But they won. And so New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, through the back door in a way, became partners in Confederation. And the first thing Nova Scotia did was throw the government out of office at the next election and send virtually an entire slate to Ottawa of members opposed to Confederation, whose first line of business was to get Nova Scotia out of Confederation. And they went to the British and they said, it's not our deal. Have to go to Ottawa, and so they went back to Ottawa and said, let us out of Confederation. And Ottawa said, no. And then that was the last of their plan. It was like, so what do we do now? Well, they weren't going to rebel. So they stayed in Confederation, and Ottawa improved the terms of Confederation slightly to make them happier. Prince Edward Island joined, of course, not because we had a change of heart. We had a change of wallet. We got railway fever. The railway was, in many ways, the railway was the computer of the mid-1800s. Every country in the Western world wanted railways. They weren't sure how it would lead them to a nirvana. They just knew that it would, that the prosperity would follow. We caught railway fever and died of it. We were going to build a railway across the spine of the island to give our farmers access to ports year-round. The railway bill was passed by a government. It was a coalition government. They broke the first sod in October of 1871. By the following March, the government fell on charges of all kinds of corruption and bribery. By the fall of 1872, the government was unable to raise money on the bond markets in London and had to go to Ottawa and say, you know that Confederation deal that we said we would never, ever, ever consider? Well, we changed our mind. We joined Confederation because our government had gone bankrupt, essentially bankrupt. We joined to avoid the government having to pass a taxation measure on islanders that would have been unpalatable in order to pay for a railway that we couldn't afford to build in the first place. And there's always been a conspiracy theory on Prince Edward Island that the construction of the railway was engineered by the Confederates on Prince Edward Island, knowing it would plunge us into debt and force us into the waiting arms of Ottawa.
Now the railway's gone.
The railway never made money, ever, ever. But fortunately, one of the terms of Confederation was that Ottawa would undertake to run the railway and finish the construction of it and to do everything that was actually required. And it eventually faded away. In the last trains, I think the end of 1989, the last of the freight trains stopped running, and now it's the Confederation Trail.
How much of the railway was built?
The original railway was about 185 miles. One of the, I guess I have time for this. One of the interesting things that happened was, there are a couple of myths with respect to the railway. One is that it was the crookedest line in Canada, and that the government paid the contractors by the mile. And so they just built a railway that went like this. There was a commission which looked into this issue, and they absolved the contractors. The contractors had pledged to build the railway at a cost that would not exceed a certain amount for every one of the miles of the railway. So it was X amount per mile. And so they chose the easiest way across our landscape to avoid having to go above the contract price. So if there was a river and it was really wide, you went up a little further till it was smaller and you could build a bridge. And you went around the big hill, not through it, when you didn't have to cut it down. So the railway was twisty and windy, but not because they were paid by the mile.
Wasn't there also some pressure by residents or communities who wanted the railway to come to their...
Absolutely. Everybody wanted a railway, so there was lots of lobbying. The charges of corruption were mostly concerned with folks giving money to members in the House in order to vote for the railway bill. And usually the person said, give me $5,000, I'll vote for the railway bill as long as it goes through my community. So that was part of the issue as well. The point of the matter was we couldn't afford a railway. And some people think that the government knew that from the beginning. And it was led by one of the Pope family who was advised by William Henry Pope, his chief advisor. So there might be a conspiracy. We've never uncovered any actual evidence of a conspiracy. We do know that the railway was the slowest as well as the twistiest railway in Canada. There were an incredible number of stops and all kinds of jokes about how slow the railway was. Was one that I came across from the 20s where the conductor comes down and there's a woman there with a small child, and the conductor says, looks at the ticket and he says, I'm sorry, only infants are allowed to be on the railway free. And she said, well, he was an infant when I got on the train. But there are many instances where people walked faster than the train was going. Anyway, but I digress. None of that's in my notes. One of the things I want to tackle here, though, for a second is vision. I mean, because Confederation happened, the heroes are the people with the vision of a nation. And the flip side of that has to be that obviously those people that opposed it were lacking in vision. there were lesser people. But isn't the actual truth is they had a vision, it was just a different vision, a vision that didn't work out. But they can't say that at Province House, because we're building nationalism,
Isn't it true
not
that
contingency. Yes?
Since with an after Confederation, or since Confederation, Atlantic Canada has never economically recovered from the 1880s. With the restrictive tariffs, concentration of industry in Ontario, that Atlantic Canada became a hero of water for the central powers.
That storyline was consolidated in the 1920s, and it's built on a foundation of partial truth. The wood-wind sail economy of our region, which had been the backbone of our wealth, and we were an international export economy, not a continental economy. And Canada did transform us from an international export economy to a continental economy, which was bad for our region. Ottawa set the tariffs and the policies, and the majority of the population weren't from the Maritimes. That is true. When we industrialized, though, it also turns out that our region industrialized very quickly. Certain areas that had the raw materials, the access to the railway or a seaport, and access to like a workforce, they industrialized. But it was the consolidation of external ownership of industry in the early years of the 1900s that had a very bad effect on those areas. So we had areas in our region that were hurting because of Confederation and because the wooden shipbuilding industry collapsed, because the international export market went into a decline. So certain areas suffered partly because of Confederation, partly because of larger trends. Some areas actually grew and prospered because of industrialization, but they, by the end of World War I, had gone into a decline. And it's at that point when we have a protest movement that people start looking at the storyline saying the mid-1800s was our golden age. It ended just when we joined the Confederation. The two are connected. So they made one the cause of the other when it is a cause but not the sole cause. So it's a very good point. And the region has generally declined in importance within the boundaries of union, at least until the birth of, the 50s with the birth of equalization grants and, development planning. But that's a kind of artificial sort of development. But anyway, sorry, that's about October in my History 232 course. All right, I need to wind up here about, here is Robert Harris. This is a photograph. I didn't know this. I found this actually out the other day. That this is the iconic painting that hung in Parliament. And it was done in 1884 by Harris, an islander who was raised here, began a career as an artist here, but moved to Montreal, and commissioned by the government to do a portrait of the Fathers of Confederation. It was initially supposed to be a portrait of the conference in Charlottetown, but they changed their commission in the middle, and they made it a portrait of the Quebec meeting. And a photographer, at some point, it didn't say when on the website, sneaked into a room where it was stored and took a photograph of it. And all the other images that we actually have are based on that snapshot in black and white of the painting. What happened to the original? I think that was hidden. I think that was a hidden fact. The Parliament buildings burned in 1916, and the painting was lost. Actually, the hidden fact is Robert Harris. Now, this is part of the commemoration phase, which is the very end of my talk, because, as I said, the storyline for Confederation in terms of history, what are the key steps, wasn't agreed upon. People didn't automatically say in 1880, Charlottetown was the first step on the road to union. But they did commission a painting of a conference that they felt was instrumental to the founding of Canada, and it was by Robert Harris, who, guess what? He was at the Charlottetown Conference. At the ball in Province House, he was in the orchestra. I forget the instrument he played, but he provided the music with a few other people for all the dancing. And so he got this as a commission. It was paid $4,000. And he said he made no money off it at all because he had to travel all over the place, researching the site, going to interview people, meeting all the fathers who were still alive, getting photographs of the one that were dead so that he could do an accurate sort of image of it. So he said in the end it wasn't worth the trouble. And when the original was lost, he was approached to do a replica. And he said, no, I'm too old. I can't face it. And so it's never been redone. Actually, there was a recreation done, and it hangs at the Confed Center. And if you're not a relative of the artist, it's actually really bad. It's a paint by numbers kind of rendition. Anyway, Commemoration. The storyline of Confederation and the role of Charlottetown as the cradle of Confederation was by no means a given. Islanders didn't seem to care that much that the conference here was the first step to Confederation, where we agreed in principle to union. When some of the fathers died, it was barely mentioned in their obituaries that they were fathers of Confederation. In fact, we didn't agree until the 1920s on who qualified to be a father of Confederation. Various people were saying, oh, I'm a father of Confederation. I was part of the government and PEI who negotiated our deal in 1873. I'm a father of Confederation. He can't be a father of Confederation. He was an inveterate opponent of the idea, et cetera, et cetera. In the 1920s, we settled on a storyline, the delegates to Charlottetown and Quebec and London. We only started making an issue of being the cradle of Confederation on PEI in 1914. It starts to show up in tourism literature just before that. And then the 50th anniversary, we were going to have a big celebration. There was going to be a big kind of party here. And then World War I broke out, and it got canceled. But Canadians were not saying we're the cradle of Confederation. Islanders weren't even saying it. In the 1920s, we start trying to copyright that phrase. And it's not for nationalistic reasons, it's for touristic reasons. We're trying to get people to come visit us in Prince Edward Island and to come to Charlottetown. So we're starting to say, come to Province House. This is where Confederation was born. But during the Depression, the chamber that you went into, that national shrine, that sacred shrine, was used as a storeroom. Then the government spent a bit of money and said, maybe we should fix that up. In 1939, we made a significant effort, again, just before the start of another major war, a significant effort to have a pageant here. And the Tourism Association made an alliance with the government, and they lobbied Ottawa to give them a grant. And Ottawa didn't want to give them a grant for their pageant, but then they said, well, we can probably justify because people will have to travel through New Brunswick and Nova Scotia to get there, and the whole region will benefit. So we had a pageant of Confederation. But by constantly repeating over and over again, we're the cradle of Confederation, we are the cradle of Confederation, we are the cradle of Confederation, we are the birthplace of Confederation, by the 1960s, most Canadians had started to think, hey, they're the cradle of Confederation. How do I know that? The seal was set on this. Well, I should say, that didn't stop the premier of PEI in 1960, I believe, from offering Province House to Ottawa if they wanted it, if Ottawa was willing to pay for a legislature, because we would like a new one. I said, you may want this, it's kind of a shrine sort of thing. Anyway, they didn't get it. But this wonderful living memorial to the Fathers of Confederation, and I'm going to skip over this. Oh yeah, I've run over time. I'm going to skip over this. It's Canada's only shrine to Confederation, and it has been always called a living memorial to Confederation, paid for by the people of the country. This is the donation list. 1/2 from the feds, 1/2 from the provinces, and the story of how these two people, not the Queen, these two people convinced the premiers and the PM of the provinces in Canada to pay thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars for a memorial on Prince Edward Island. It's a fascinating story that I could tell you because I've done a paper on it, but We don't have time. And that's why we're the cradle of Confederation. And here's the big wind-up. Room of Destiny, yes, that was my fact number 10, was the fact that it was used as a storage room. Confederation isn't just an event. Confederation is a dynamic, ongoing relationship. Jean Lesage was one of the early supporters of the center, of the project. He pledged money from Quebec at the beginning. And that stunned me as an historian. Jean Lesage, the Premier of Quebec, Quebec being unhappy in Confederation. And he said he was unhappy with Confederation, but he believed in the promise of Confederation. He believed in the vision of Confederation, and he could support what Confederation could be, not what it was. The Confederation Center and a national shrine like this represents a vision of what Canada can be. And Confederation isn't just an event, it's an ongoing relationship. And that means that you have a role to play in Confederation, in your roles as judges. So now, the story's over to you. Thank you.
Well, Professor Ed, fellow judges and guests, Gordon, after firing me as weatherman, gave me the privilege of thanking a guest speaker this morning. But before I do that, I just want to take one moment of the 2 moments that I'm here to throw another bouquet. I think our chair, Gordon Campbell, arranged it better than he knew this morning when he arranged for the Confederation players to take us up Great George Street, or take you up for those of us who were late, didn't get there, but up Great George, and then have the interpretation in Province House, the presentation by the Speaker of the Legislature, and then our keynote lecturer, Dr. Ed McDonald. So Gordon, on behalf of all of the judges of the association and guests, we thank you very much for your fine organization. And sensing genuine enthusiasm in the applause there, I'm
It's my wife wondering how it went. Sorry. Yes.
Ed, we want to thank you. Those of us from the island are very proud of Ed and his great knowledge of history, and especially of the history of Prince Edward Island. We know that it was exciting for you too. His presentation was humorous, informative. It was interactive, and it was as exciting as a cross-examination, Ed. I know you don't go to cross-examination. So there you have it. But I know that most of us have not heard anybody except a judge speak for 2 hours straight through at one time, and that was great to have. Ed, in his book, The History of the 20th Century, if you're faint-hearted...
Strong-hearted.
If you're strong-hearted...
If you're faint-hearted, don't read the book.
If you're strong-hearted, in the prologue of that book, I always find it very interesting. It says, things aren't what they used to be, and they never were. And so you can take as much fact or fiction from what he said today. No, I think it was all fact that he gave us, and it's great to get a history lecture that brings it all to life. And we thank you very much, and we appreciate you taking the time and the effort to come with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. Thank you.